Bob Bauer and Jack Goldsmith. They're here to talk about their book, After Trump, Reconstructing the Presidency. Jack's a veteran of a Republican administration. Bob worked in a Democratic one. And together they've written a sort of guide to the damage that Donald Trump's presidency did to our governing institutions. And they've suggested how to go about repairing and better protecting our system. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. The chat function also will be active, though for comments, not questions. Put your questions in the Q&A column. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of After Trump. Now, Jack served under President George W. Bush, first as a special counsel to the Department of Defense from 2002 to 2003, and then as head of the Office of Legal Counsel at the Justice Department from 2003 to 2004. He's now a professor at Harvard Law School. He's also co-founder of Lawfare and has written previous books, one a firsthand account of the legal battling in the Bush administration over counterterrorism policy and actions, the other about the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa and Jack's relationship with his own stepfather, who was a prime suspect in the disappearance. Bob served as White House Counsel to President Obama from 2010 to 2011 and was a senior advisor to Joe Biden's campaign. He's a professor at NYU's Law School and co-director there of the Legislative and Regulatory Process Clinic. Jack and Bob's book came out last fall before it was known whether or not Trump would win a second term. But now that he's out of office, the book is especially relevant to today's national discussion over how to repair the battered institutions Trump left behind. The book's basic premise is that the reform effort will require more than just a different and more appropriate attitude by Biden and his team. Trump's presidency, Jack and Bob argue, exposed gaps and ambiguities in laws and norms and broader weaknesses in presidential accountability that will require some serious restructuring and guard against excuse me, I have something here that's blocking what I was saying. That will guard against similar exploitation by a potential future president with authoritarian tendencies. The authors put forward in their book as many as 50 proposed changes to laws, regulations, and norms as reform measures. I'm sure we're in for a lively discussion. So Bob and Jack, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Graham. I'm going to speak first. I'm Jack Goldsmith. Very grateful as always to Politics and Prose for having us to discuss this book and to everyone for listening. The book is called After Trump, Reconstructing the Presidency. I'm going to talk about why Bob and I wrote this book and then briefly summarize the reform project that we propose in the book. As Mr. Graham said, the book was published in September of 2020. We said in the preface that we didn't know if After Trump would be 2021 or 2025. We now know that After Trump is with us. And so after I explain in general terms what the book is about, Bob is going to talk about where the reform project is now, the urgency of reforming the presidency now, the prospects and priorities for reform, and what we're doing to help achieve reform. So I'm going to start by talking about how Bob and I came to write this book. Bob served in the Obama administration. I served in the George W. Bush administration. We both served in senior executive branch lawyer positions. Bob was in the White House. I was in the Justice Department. We have different political outlooks on things. We became friends after Bob left the Obama administration. Bob was teaching a class at NYU Law School on counterterrorism, which I went to. We started discussing our views about the proper role of lawyers in the executive branch. And we had actually agreed initially to write a book about the White House Counsel's office, which is the office, the top lawyer in the White House who advises the president on a personal basis, representing the government, but on a very close basis with the president. There's never been a great book about the White House Counsel. Bob had strong views about it, and so did I from our different perspectives. We met one day to talk about that book and outline that book. This was about a year and a half ago. And in the course, this was, I think, in January of 2020. And in the course of sort of trying to sketch out that book, we kept coming back to the Trump presidency. And we kept talking about all the things that Trump had done to violate norms and expose limits and accountability. And we are both students of the presidential reform of the 1970s, the ones that were the famously implemented after Watergate, after Vietnam, after the Church Commission, reforms that really regulated every aspect of the presidency after the debacle of the imperial presidency in the early 70s. Reforms that worked remarkably well, in our view, for 40 or 50 years, but reforms which seemed to have run their course by the time Trump came into office. And so by the end of the day, Bob and I decided that we wanted to write it. We were of the view that when Trump left office, there was going to be a similar conversation and a similar need for comprehensive reform of the presidency, akin to what happened in the 1970s. And so we set out to basically write a book that would be something of a roadmap to how to think about those reforms. Before I get to what we propose, I want to explain, because I don't think this is very clearly understood, the unique challenges to the presidency that Donald Trump posed. Obviously, Trump was not the first president to be accused of excessive uses of presidential power. Some of his predecessors' characteristic excesses, or at least alleged excesses, such as unilateral uses of force in really aggressive ways, or unilateral extensions of administrative power. These were not the kind of, or as my boss, George W. Bush, did, disregarding laws in the name of Article 2 power, presidential power. These were not Trump's characteristic abuses. Trump's abuses, if I had to summarize them, were the following. He basically merged the institutional presidency, the office of the presidency, the public office, with his personal interests in a way that had never been done by a president, and in a way that basically covered the landscape in every form of corruption. And just to give you some examples, these are all examples that we'll remember from the Trump presidency: not disclosing his taxes, not disclosing his finances. These were all things that presidents had done going back to the 70s. In a really egregious way, mixing his business interests with his public office and using his public office to try to promote and profit off of his business interests, not separating himself from his businesses the way other presidents had, intervening in Justice Department cases in ways that we hadn't seen since Watergate, to protect himself and to protect others, his political friends, and also to try to urge the Justice Department to use its very powerful tools to hurt his enemies. Trump used his control over diplomacy and law enforcement to nudge foreign powers to help him win the election. John Bolton's book, John Bolton, the very conservative John Bolton, who saw Trump up close and personal, said, in the context of his kind of both of law enforcement and in his kind of abuse of the diplomatic power, he basically said that Trump seemed to commit obstruction of justice as a way of life. Another example, and the last one I'll use, of course, is the pardon power, where Trump used the pardon power promiscuously and not in obvious ways illegally, but certainly abusively. There's never been a president, no president has come close to using the pardon power in self-serving ways to help friends, to pursue a political agenda, to help himself in the way that Trump did. Some presidents had done some of that in the past, but that was exceptional. Trump made it into the rule. So these were all what Bob and I would call serious abuses of power. Amazingly, they're not necessarily illegal. Some of these things might have been illegal. It's not clear, but most of these abuses of power and most of Trump's other abuses of power were, for various reasons, not law violative. They were certainly norm violative. And this is a distinction we've heard a lot. Let me say a bit about it. Norms are the expectations of behavior that we have for presidents that aren't enforceable by law. They don't have a penalty that attaches to them, a legal penalty. You can't enforce them in court. There's no potential prosecution. These are rules of expected behavior that presidents who act like presidents are expected to do. And these norms, for the most part, grew up naturally. And after the 70s, they grew up self-consciously. And presidents had complied with conflict of interest rules and independence rules with the Justice Department and the like. Trump blew through all of these norms, and he exposed all of these norms as basically useless in constraining the president. He was indifferent to these norms, which are vitally important to our confidence in executive power and to ensuring that the president acts in the public interest and in accordance with the law, even if the sanction is norms and not law. It's pretty clear that Trump also attempted to violate the law many times, and he may have. I mean, we can talk about particular instances if you want. The most extraordinary episode of this is the 10 episodes recounted in the Mueller investigation about Trump trying to interfere with law enforcement in connection with the investigation of him. I'll come back to that episode in a moment. Another element of Trump's abuses were that, and this is typical of populist demagogues, he made it commonplace to attack the most important institutions of the American presidency. Every important institution was subject to Trump's attack, including Congress, the courts, his own officials, members of his own party, judges, I've already said that, state officials, the institutions within the executive branch like the FBI and the CIA. He sought to denigrate and devalue and to destroy trust in all of these institutions. So what do you do about a president like this? Well, so the book that Bob and I wrote is premised on the idea that we may have another Trump. And indeed, we may have a much more clever Trump. One of the most important things to understand about Trump is that he was actually, in many instances, thankfully, incompetent at wielding executive power. He wasn't very good. I mean, those 10 episodes I mentioned in the Mueller report about Trump trying to get someone to stop the Mueller investigation, to fire Mueller and the like. The amazing thing was that the president of the United States, who had the formal power to accomplish that, he couldn't get anyone to do it. He wasn't good at wielding executive power to achieve his ends. And the worry is that these gaps in accountability, these weak norms, these gaps in law are going to still be there when we have another president who's a populist demagogue. And it could be a Republican / right-wing populist demagogue, or it could be a Democrat / left-wing populist demagogue. But the worry is you're going to have a more competent president who can take even greater advantages of these weaknesses. So we basically think that the time for action is now, and Bob will talk more about that and why that's so. So if I were in describing, let me just say four of our assumptions, our working assumptions in proposing a set of reforms that we do for fixing the presidency, so to speak. Neither Bob nor I, we say this in the book explicitly, our project is not to significantly reduce presidential power. We don't think that the office of the presidency needs to be, the executive branch and the office of the presidency needs to be significantly shrunk. There's a conversation to be had about that. It's not our project. We think that the presidency is vital to the operation of the Constitution, to the operation of the economy, and to national security, that we have a powerful presidency. But the presidency but the public needs to have confidence that the president is acting in accordance to law, that the president is acting in the public interest. And so the president needs to be constrained and accountable to the people, and that is our project. We're also very attentive. There are lots of reforms that of the presidency that in the past have ended up making things worse rather than better. The famous example of this is the independent counsel statute after Watergate, which created a super independent counsel to examine allegations of executive branch malfeasance. That was in the 1970s. By the end of the 1990s, after the experience with the Clinton impeachment and the like, there was bipartisan consensus that it had gone too far and it had made confidence in government worse, not better. And this happens a lot in presidential reform. So we're very attentive to how reforms can be weaponized and abused in proposing the reforms that we do. Bob and I also acted by what we called the golden rule, and that is we try to, we don't agree on everything, especially about political matters, but we tried to use that as a strength. We came into this project thinking that if we could agree on things, maybe there was a way to achieve a broader consensus about these things. And we ended up agreeing on everything in the book, except for one thing, which we can talk about again if you want. But the idea was that any constraint that we were proposing for a president, we decided is a constraint that would be acceptable to us, to both of us, if our preferred presidency were in office. And that any power or discretion we were giving a president is one that we would be comfortable being exercised by a president that was someone we didn't vote for or didn't want to be in office. And I'm not claiming political detachment and neutrality and objectivity for ourselves, but we tried to step back as much as we could from the politics in addressing these issues. And the final general point I'll make is that we really were attentive to the lessons of history, which is important for many reasons here. Every chapter of the book, I think there are 14 chapters, 13 reform chapters. Every chapter of the book sketches the history of the particular presidential power or discretion in issue. And it talks about how these powers had worked for prior presidents. For a lot of these, Trump was the most abusive of presidents, not all of them, but most of them. But a lot of them had prehistories of other presidents doing things similar. And we thought it was important to put both prior reforms and prior presidential actions in each chapter to put Trump in context and to learn from those prior presidential actions and prior attempts at reform so as not to commit mistakes. Okay, with that rather lengthy background in mind, I'm just going to briefly summarize the reforms of the book without getting into any detail. Bob will discuss, I think, some of these in more detail. So the book has three parts. Part one focuses on how to achieve better protections against abuses of presidential power for personal and political gain. And most of these reforms are reforms that need to be implemented by Congress. And most of these reforms are basically have the following quality. They were governed by norms in the past: tax disclosure, conflict of interests, limits on the pardon power. They were governed pretty successfully by norms in the past. And we think Trump shows that those norms are just inadequate. And we need real, enforceable, hard legal constraints to ensure that the president, for example, to counter the growing foreign state intervention in presidential campaigns, the Mueller report revealed gaps in the way that foreign influence in U.S. elections are regulated. We think those gaps need to be closed by statute. We think that the norms that worked pretty well in preventing conflicts of interest, presidential conflicts of interest, they need to be made into very strictly enforceable law. The president needs to be separated by law on pain of criminal penalty from his businesses. There needs to be, his businesses need to be completely open. His foreign state investments especially need to be open and reported to Congress. And all of this needs to have a legal machinery behind it. The tax disclosure requirement, which worked quite well as a matter of norms until Trump, needs to be made a matter of law. And finally, in this chapter, we think that it's hard to reform the pardon power because the pardon power is one of the core powers of the president in Article 2. But we believe that there are ways that Congress can put guardrails on extreme abuses of presidential power, especially the use of a pardon for a bribe or the use of a pardon to obstruct justice. And we think the law can and should be clarified to make clear that the president does himself commit a crime if he does these things. And we're pretty confident that these are constitutional and permissible for Congress to do. And we also propose that Congress make very clear that the presidential self-pardon, which Trump threatened but didn't follow through on, is not constitutional. Congress won't have the final word on that, but it can certainly have a say in what the Supreme Court's final view on that if it ever comes up. That's part one of the book. Part two of the book focuses on the very complicated and delicate relationship between the White House and the Justice Department when it comes to law enforcement and the rule of law in this country. This is a really tough issue. The reason, and there's no single silver bullet, single reform to fix this. And we have lots of proposals. One of the problems is in this area, it's hard for Congress to regulate because this is, again, a core presidential power. Law enforcement and the supervision of the Justice Department is at the core of the president's executive power and his take care clause power. And this is why so many elements, starting at Watergate, of managing this relationship has been done by norms rather than through statutory reform. And Bob and I have a series of reforms to basically, a lot of instances came up where the norms just weren't clear. And when they weren't clear, they were disregarded or circumvented. A lot of instances, the norms were just missing. And a lot of instances, the norms weren't, they didn't have an enforcement mechanism. Now, there are a lot of people who are skeptical that reforms can be done to the Justice Department, norms-based reforms that'll be binding on a future president who's less beholden to norms. And that's certainly a legitimate concern. But norms worked even in the Trump presidency. There were a lot of things that Donald Trump wanted his Justice Department to do that they didn't do. Not perfectly, they didn't work perfectly, but they worked remarkably well. And we think that there are a lot of steps that can be taken to the special counsel regulations to make clear that politicized prosecutions are not allowed, and throughout all of the DOJ guidance, to how FBI investigations of presidential campaigns and presidents should be conducted, to rethinking the relationship between the lawyers in the White House and the lawyers in the Justice Department, and actually taking some power away from the White House lawyers where politics are even higher on the list than they are in the Justice Department in determining what the law is. Most of these reforms, as I say, are internal to the executive branch. Some of them need to be have congressional support. For example, it's vitally important that Congress enact and make clear that the president can, in certain circumstances, commit obstruction of justice. This is not clear, and it needs to be clear for a whole variety of reasons, and we have a very concrete proposal on that. Very briefly, and then I'll stop. Part 3 is about more traditional separation of powers issues between the president and the Congress. And we could have written a book about this. We focus primarily on the war powers, on the war on terrorism and the AUMF and what should be done there, on the war powers resolution of the 70s and how that can be reformed to curb some of the most extreme abuses of presidential war power. And also we have reforms to put some constraints on the president's quite extraordinary unilateral power to use nuclear weapons whenever the president decides. We also have suggestions, complicated suggestions, I'm afraid, about vacancies reform, about the president's ability to basically fill in positions in government that are supposed to be filled by Senate-confirmed persons. And Trump, like other presidents, found ways to circumvent those rules or to exploit loopholes. Trump more than his predecessors. This is a process that's not good for the functioning of government. We think that the Senate the Congress has to meet the president halfway by reducing the number of Senate appointments, but we propose reforms for that. Again, this is a more traditional long-term separation of powers problem. We also talk about emergency powers and how they need to be fixed, and also ways to buck up, give Congress more power in enforcing its subpoenas. So that's a whole lot of stuff. I didn't go into detail on any of them. That's a very high-level overview of the book. And now I'm going to turn it over to Bob to talk about where we are now on these reforms.
Thank you, Jack. We wrote this following, of course, a period over the course of the Trump presidency of just intense concern about his conduct. And as Jack pointed out, we also tried to put what he did in historical context and show how he built on some of the norm breaking, or some would say imperial tendencies of his predecessors in certain respects, so that he was both blazing a trail, but he was also following a path that other presidents in certain respects had laid before him. He simply took it to lengths that nobody imagined a president would take it. He was very frontal about it. And as I mentioned, as I said at the outset, the concern was very intense, and there were significant questions that continued well beyond our completion of the book, and issues that arose that Jack and I did not have an opportunity to write about, but would if we were to turn around and write this book again today, or write a second edition to it. And that would include what we learned about what happens under our system if a president refuses to concede the loss of an election and goes about doing what he can to obstruct the peaceful transition of power. And then there's a whole set of issues, and I'll come back to them in a minute, having to do with the ongoing effort that he made to put the results of the election into doubt, continuing through the events of January 6th and beyond. So the question is, having passed through this intense period of concern, where do we stand now? And I want to make a general sort of statement that I think Jack and I both subscribe to, and then talk about what problem it presents and how we might address it. And that is that we need to capture some of the momentum toward reform that I think over time, in some respects, has been dissipated or channeled into other efforts. Now, it's understandable in a country that has faced a pandemic and all the social and economic dislocations associated with the pandemic, that once Donald Trump left office, there would be an attention on the part of the new administration and on the part of the Congress to addressing these large national problems. And process reform is never simple, and it does engage the two political parties in sort of disputes about the intended meaning or purposes of particular approaches to reform. But one way or the other, this is not a period like the Watergate period. After Watergate, there was a really sustained effort over a number of years to absorb the lessons and to enact reforms that appear to take full account of those lessons in reform of the executive branch in a number of ways. And Jack touched on them very briefly. And I want to go back to that and talk about how we deal with the differences between what I would call the faltering attention to this reform period that I think is urgent in this time, and how it is very different from the experience after Watergate, and how we want to try to recapture that momentum before it is too late. That is to say, before we find that the momentum is dissipated altogether, or it is dissipated and then another president, as Jack suggests, takes office sometime in the future with the same demagogic populist tendencies, who might be even craftier, more effective in norm busting and in effectuating illegal schemes, intended illegal schemes, than Donald Trump was. So let me say something really quickly about Watergate. I came to town really in the thick of the Watergate episode. I was in law school when all this took place, and I was actually interning on Capitol Hill during the summer that brought everything to a head, and Nixon had resigned. But I look back very recently, and what was really quite striking is, even in a period of time where there were significant differences between the two political parties, there was an appreciation of the urgency of reforms in some respects, even if there were significant disagreements between the parties about the details. And there was also a robust civil society response in the Watergate period, which is to say, and I'll single out two sectors, law and the religious community. There were leaders in those communities who joined with elected officials and members of the bar, and I certainly shouldn't put the bar anywhere but at the top here, in talking about the significance of the Nixon episode for our understanding of flaws in our scheme of constitutional governance and the need for reform. So, for example, during Watergate, and speaking now particularly of the national shock at the so-called Saturday Night Massacre, when President Nixon dismissed Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. He was unable to have his order to do so followed by the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General, and eventually the Solicitor General had to effect the firing. But the response there was not only a congressional and political response, there was also a strong institutional civil society response. And Chesterfield Smith, who was the president of the American Bar Association and a Republican, issued a statement, not just in his own name, but in the name of the bar itself, saying that no person was above the law. He framed it at the time, no man is above the law. He'd have to frame it differently today. But his point was that no American is above the law, and the president is certainly not above the law. And other leaders of institutions that are important to the associations that make so much of a difference in the lives of Americans also spoke out. The leaders of the National Council of Churches, the U.S. Catholic Conference, the American Union of American Hebrew Congregations, all through their leadership issued stern admonitions to the public that something extraordinary was happening that was threatening to constitutional governance and had to be addressed. And I'll quote just briefly from a letter that was issued by the president of the National Council of Churches and the general secretary on the occasion of this Saturday Night Massacre. And I'm quoting, "The dismissal of Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox represents the nation with a moral crisis of highest magnitude and one which demands a response, period," unquote. And this is one in a number of places where you can look in the Watergate period and see the country coming together slowly but surely across significant partisan divides, and recognizing that a moment to reckon with in the constitutional history of the country had occurred, and it was critical to have a significant reform program. So what occurred? Well, a reform program over a series of years from 1974 through 78 into 1979, a reform program touching on a number of areas of concern about the institutional presidency did take place. Some of these reforms tapped into reform movements that had been extant for some time before, and there's some debate about the extent to which they really related to Watergate. An example would be regulation of campaign finance, the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1974, or the amendments of 1974 to the core statute that had been passed in 1971. And it is true, of course, that over this period of time, the Democrats had very large majorities in the Congress, from the 93rd to the 95th Congress, from 1974 through 1978 into 79. The Democrats had very large majorities, which really actually didn't shift in the other direction until the Reagan election and congressional successes in 1980. But having said that, you can't even posit the strong Democratic presence in the Congress as the sole reason why these reforms were passed. There were bipartisan agreements that something had to be done, even when, as I said, there were disagreements about the details. Let me give you a few examples, which by contemporary standards might seem quite remarkable. The Ethics in Government Act in the wake of Watergate, which provided, among other things, for the independent counsel experiment that led down that tortuous road to the special counsel regulations that we have today, and the personal financial disclosure requirements, anti-corruption measures that were enacted binding on the president, the vice president, and members of Congress, passed the House in a vote on the conference bill by a margin of 370 to 23. And it passed in the Senate by a margin of 74 to 5. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that was designed to address the question of the authority of the government in the name of national security to conduct electronic surveillance on American soil of US citizens or agents of foreign principals located in the United States. That reform, though it wasn't without controversy for a number of reasons I'll mention, passed the Senate 95 to 1, and the House of Representatives passed it ultimately 266 to 176. There was a little bit of irritation in the House over amendments that had proposed that the Senate had rejected all the way through. So there was some institutional annoyance there, and also some disagreements about how far to bind the president and what role to devolve upon a special court, the court that was established pursuant to that statute. But nonetheless, you see this really remarkable margin of support for it. And I'll mention one more, having to do with President Nixon's attempt to refuse to spend the money that Congress had appropriated for domestic programs enacted into law, the Congressional and Budget Impoundment Act of 1974. That passed the Senate by a 75 to 0 margin. That was after the Senate passed an amended measure by a margin of 80 to nothing, and it passed the House 401 to 6. Okay, so where are we today? Well, we're nowhere near that. We have significant stalling out of this argument over reform that ought to be taking place, this coming together around reform that ought to be taking place, because this issue in a polarized politics, like so many that we're dealing with, has become very polarized. And so gradually, even what happened on January 6th has been subject to new competing narratives about what really happened, whether it really was an insurrection or simply a collection of people who were curiosity seekers who got out of control. And I think we see, of course, this debate taking place in a number of contexts and paralyzed in this respect on a partisan basis. I think everybody realizes we're having this conversation today on the day that the Senate is attempting to vote on a political reform statute, S1, HR1 in the House, that does have elements of executive branch reform in it, but it is also concerned with many other things like campaign finance reform, redistricting reform, Voting Rights Act reform. And that, of course, is caught up in complete partisan deadlock. And there's been a huge amount of talk about whether or not the Democrats, as a result, are going to be impelled to challenge the filibuster and to attempt to take that down, if either overall or for limited purposes. And yet we can think, and this is what Jack and I tried to do in the book, we can think of ways of designing reform that, even if they do not provide for each political party what it believes is absolutely required, will provide some basis for capturing some momentum in this battle. And just on voting reform for a minute, and this is not a topic that Jack and I address in our book, we know now that a president of the United States has urged the vice president of the United States, in what was once thought to be his ministerial capacity, to disregard the Electoral Count Act and attempt to send the vote back to the states, where state legislatures, presumably in states that Republicans could count on, would simply disregard that tally. That Electoral Count Act, enacted in 1887, is in desperate need of revision so that those kinds of claims can't be made in the future. That seems one where, again, the golden rule that Jack articulated could be fruitfully followed. And even the rules that govern our impeachment process, and we've had a good number of impeachments, two in the Biden, in the Trump years, and then, of course, Clinton-Nixon impeachments. It's been clear that there are institutional reforms in the Senate that could make the Senate into a much more effective body to consider articles of impeachment. Actually, the House, a more effective body in bringing them to the Senate, and the Senate a more effective body in considering them. We think, however, in the core areas that we address in the book, and Jack has touched on much of this, there are ways that reforms can be designed that address the fundamental requirement that neither party can accuse the other one of writing a reform in its own narrow partisan self-interest, claiming high-minded motives, but not in fact possessing them. And there are some priorities, it seems to me, some that have developed since we wrote our book, like transition reform, but others that Jack has mentioned, like making it clear that the president is subject to obstruction of justice in a properly designed statutory reform, or making it clear what the boundaries are in the political abuse of the pardon power. We think these are reforms that can be addressed, and there are others Congress actually is displaying some bipartisan interest in the area of war powers, and steps have been taken to begin to, for example, consider repealing authorization of the use of military force that was passed by the Congress to address the situation in Iraq many years ago, and that many believe have become the basis for presidential assertions of authority well beyond what Congress ever intended in issuing that or in enacting that AUMF. So the question is, are we able to do that? And I think the time is now, if we don't allow this reform moment to pass by. We have a Democratic president who has indicated he feels very strongly about institutional capacities and institutional norms, and that he will support institutional reform, and has already expressed that support, say, for war powers reform, for measures that are necessary to restore the independence of the Department of Justice. And having a willing president at the end of the day who signs rather than vetoes a bill is indispensable. And so that's a moment we should not allow to pass. And I also think it's important to say that even if we discount some of the extreme claims made in the former President Trump's wing of his political party, there are Republicans who do recognize that this door swings both ways, and that this is a fundamental issue of constitutional governance, of putting the presidency on a constitutionally accountable basis that is really critically important, and one that ought to command the support of both political parties. And so we do think there's Republican support to be had, but again, it goes to the question of how these reforms are designed. And that's why the opening chapters and comments in the book about the approach we took is so important to understanding what we were trying to accomplish. Let me close by saying we think there's huge danger that we could face this problem again, that the fears that materialize, the dangers that materialized during the Trump administration could materialize again, that future presidents with a comparable, as we said, demagogic populist bent could attempt maybe more effectively even than Trump to test norms and test legal boundaries, test constitutional boundaries in the way that Trump professed he wanted to do and many times attempted to do. And therefore, we should not be sanguine. Jack and I have been encouraged to continue following the writing of this book to do more with the advocacy for these reforms in a more formal, structured way. And that's what we are going to do. And we've received support from a number of directions, and we'll be talking about that publicly very soon, because we think this is something that does require systematic attention during a period of time that could pass us by if we're not careful. So I'll close my comments with that.
Well, let me encourage everybody who hasn't yet to post their questions in the Q&A column. We have a few, and I'll go ahead and ask them now, but there's room for more questions. Now, a couple of these questions speak to, Bob, the point you were just making about how to get around the divisiveness that exists. But I'll read them, and maybe you can talk further about that. Mike says, how can we make these reforms when one party is intent on accepting most, if not all, of Donald Trump's bad actions? And Susan notes that there's an outright assault by elected officials to attack democracy, with Republicans doing everything they can to stop Americans who don't vote their way from voting, with minimal interference from the Democrats. How can change happen? How does a huge segment of America become more hopeful again?
Actually, I follow on and take a quick crack at that. I'm a Democrat, and I probably, just judging from the questions, share a lot of the views that the individuals asking those questions have on these voting rights questions. I was a senior advisor, and my portfolio included voting rights in 2020 to the Biden campaign, and spent a huge amount of my time on litigation and other measures to try to protect the right to vote in 2020. And I have strong views on this topic and have held them for many years. And so I am quite confident that even the Republican colleagues of mine with whom I have excellent working relationships will disagree about who's responsible for distorting which arguments in this reform debate. But I certainly am squarely on the side of those who think that we need more access, more protected access for voters, and that many of the legislative enactments we see around the country are really seriously problematic, legally flawed, morally flawed in any number of ways. I have objections to them. What I think in the project that, and I'm working on this also on voting rights too, I think in the project that Jack and I are working on, there are paths to reform, again, that may not, and that doesn't mean you set the other fights aside and you don't pursue them. They may not get you everything you're looking for in the areas where the parties are most divided, but you can find some ground of agreement. I'll give you just one example real quickly, just to go to voting rights. And I think there are others that Jack and I found writing this book together. There are pathways to some reform. And if you get some of it done, if you're able to do an obstruction of justice statute, for example, that captures the president clearly in a thoughtfully designed way, if you're able to curb the pardon power in a way that is consistent with constitutional requirements and really revives a norm that was so aggressively challenged by Trump and puts legal boundaries around abuses, that may not be everything you're looking for in the reform of the democracy, but it's a very important start. And I'll give you one last example in the voting rights area. I'm working with Republicans right now on the defense of election officials who are under personal and official attack in the states. And they need to be provided with support because they're not getting them from their state legislatures, who are the principal victimizers, if you will, the principal assailants. And I'm finding Republican support for that, and I'm working with those Republicans, and I think there are paths. I just think we have to be very thoughtful about how to find those paths and then move in the direction of accomplishing something in the nature of reform to achieve some momentum in that direction.
Oh, hey, Jack, you're on mute.
Can I add something briefly to that? So just to underscore something Bob said, there are many problems and issues in our constitutional democracy, and many channels where reform might be appropriate, including of the presidency. One is electoral reform. We don't discuss that in this book. That's a huge topic on its own. Another is reform of Congress. You might think that a lot of the problems with the too powerful, non-norm compliant president is that Congress has not been exercising its constitutional responsibilities. We don't have proposals for that. What we focus on are proposals that arose, most of which became clear during the Trump years. And we focus on fixing the kind of the back end after you have a populist demagogic president elected. And just to underscore something Bob said, we haven't seen it yet, but there are reasons to think there are Republicans who support some of these proposals, and they have even made some of these proposals in Congress. And a lot of the proposals, especially the ones that we have prioritized, are ones for which there was a bipartisan consensus for 50 years. And the hope is that if you put these reforms forward when a Democrat is in office, and it's an unusual situation that you have a Democrat who might be president, who might be willing to accept these constraints, that you're able to kind of grab off some of that earlier consensus among enough Republicans to make this a reality. Now, I'll just acknowledge, if these reforms are packaged as anti-Trump reforms, and the closer we get to the next presidential election, and the closer it gets to Trump maybe declaring that he's going to run, it gets harder and harder. But that's why reform, it's really urgent that this be done quickly. But these are issues on which there has been bipartisan consensus for decades until Trump. And there's reason to think it may be possible again on some of these issues.
Yeah, although you just said that you didn't deal with electoral reform, let me just toss this question out from John anyway. It seems to me in order to avoid another Trump from taking office, we need to fix the process that allowed him to win the nomination of a main political party. How do we fix that problem? Trump never should have made it past New Hampshire. You want to take a whack at that?
Well, I'm happy to take the first crack. I mean, I have done a lot of work on and like everybody else suffered through the presidential nominating process in this country. And to say that it is flawed in many respects is an understatement. And we could have 10 of these programs and we barely scratch the surface of the weaknesses in the procedures by which we choose, and I wouldn't say the parties choose them, even the voters registered with particular parties and participating in party primaries choose the party's nominees for president. And I'm not even sure how to get a handle on this point because there are so many aspects of it that are problematic. As you know, the parties have really lost control of the nominating process. They've outsourced responsibility in many respects, although that improved somewhat in the Democratic Party the last time around. Outsourced responsibility for the presidential debates to the news media. They have had an opportunity, for example, in July in Cleveland to try to block Trump, who had never been a Republican and who posed a real threat, who was continuously deriding the Republican Party leadership. They had an opportunity to potentially put the nomination into question, didn't take it because the party just did not believe it had really institutionally the capacity to make that kind of decision. This is a very tough topic, and I sympathize with the questioner's perplexity because it is a reason why, frankly, there's no reason in the world to doubt that a politician like Donald Trump, but as we said before, maybe someone cleverer and more effective in pursuing his or her designs, couldn't make it through the nominating process again.
Mike has just posted another question. How can we reform the pardon power without a constitutional amendment?
You want me to take that, Bob?
Yeah, please.
So as I alluded to, it's hard, and you can't have the pardon power is a very broad, the Supreme Court has described it in very expansive terms. And most of Trump's self-serving, politically self-serving pardons, you can't reform by statute because the Constitution allows the president to make politically self-serving pardons. However, we're confident after a study of executive branch legal opinions and looking at the legal precedents that while you can't stop a president from pardoning whoever he wants, Congress can criminalize that pardon while not in any way impacting the president's ability to pardon. You can make it a crime for the president to pardon in exchange for a bribe or in exchange for or as part of an obstruction of justice scheme. And even Article 2 hardliners like, for example, Bill Bauer have suggested that this can be done. We explain in detail in the book why we think that's not a burden on the pardon power, because it allows the pardon to go through, but it is a regulation of the president of the consequences, or at least the motivation behind the pardon power. We think that can survive constitutional challenge. There's reason to think so in the executive branch precedents, and there's nothing in the Supreme Court precedents that rules it out. It's not a slam dunk legal argument, but we think it can work. More importantly, let me just say one more thing. It will almost certainly never be tested in court. And it's the kind of thing, and this is something very important to understand, laws like this can inform the behavior of executive branch officials, even if they think it's never going to be enforced. This is what happened. This is why the Trump subordinates didn't help him fire Mueller. They were worried about possible obstruction of justice themselves. And so a statute on the books like this can dissuade a president from committing abusive pardons, and certainly the ones that would be illegal under the statutory scheme, even if it's never enforced.
Another questioner asks whether you discuss the Department of Justice policy that prevents a sitting president from being indicted. Do you anticipate that this will be modified?
Bob and I have a little bit of a disagreement on this. I think I'll let Bob speak for himself. I think that opinion was probably correct. I think Bob has some problems with the opinion. In the book, we assume the validity of the opinion, but it was twice affirmed by the Justice Department, one during the Nixon or maybe Ford administration in the 1970s, and then again at the end of the Clinton administration. And our proposals assume the continuing validity of that executive branch ruling. And I'll let Bob speak to this, but it's something that could be overturned if it's just all it would take was the Justice Department to decide it no longer thought that was the right view of the law. The Justice Department has a very strong rule of stare decisis about its past opinions. This is an issue on which it's looked twice, but it's conceivable that they will change it. I don't know what the administration's plans are about that. Bob, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I don't know. I do have real qualms with the two opinions. They were both issued in the administrations of presidents who were facing criminal investigation and impeachment. And that doesn't suggest in and of itself that they were wrong, but I am concerned about the way those opinions were constructed. And I think that we now have a problem that Jack and I discuss in the book. And then we just have slight difference of opinion about how to address the problem, that on the one hand, people assume, well, if the president is in office, then he or she cannot be prosecuted, can be investigated, but not prosecuted. Indictments can't be brought. But when they leave office, there's this general sense, and a little bit of this is the sort of the wave of, or the aftermath of the Ford Nixon pardon, that it's so divisive for one administration to prosecute the former president of another administration. It's such a dangerous road to travel there that perhaps a better part of wisdom is just not to do it. Now, as Jack points out in the book, and he can speak to this himself, of course, he's not arguing that conduct prior to becoming president is somehow immune from prosecution, not arguing that any pending prosecutions ought to be suspended. The concern that I think we debate in the book is a concern that some have with an administration looking at a prior administration and making a concerted effort to determine whether laws were broken, and then potentially on that basis prosecuting a former president, that it would be divisive and create diversions, might in some cases be particularly divisive and dangerous if, for example, the prosecutions are unsuccessful and the former president is, quote unquote, vindicated. I tend to be more willing to take that risk than Jack would be. I mean, he warns about this perhaps a little bit more darkly than I would. But I think at the bottom, we have to start rethinking just, what do we mean? What does Chesterfield Smith, what did he mean in 1974 when the president of the ABA said no president is above the law? Well, we have to make that mean something.
You do come from different political backgrounds. So let me ask, how much did you disagree in writing this book? And to the extent that you did, were the differences more over, say, the analysis of the problem and identifying what is a problem or what isn't, or were the differences over, did they tend to be over the solutions?
I'll address this in the first instance. let me say that I've written 5 or 6 books. I've had several co-authors. This was such a joy to write this book with Bob. And it was a learning process for both of us. We didn't know each other that well when we started to write it. We didn't have a full sense of each other's views. But we both went in with a spirit of complete open-mindedness to the other's arguments. And we went back and forth on a whole bunch of issues. And I think it's fair to say that we were both open to the other's arguments. We ended up agreeing on almost 99% of the things. I mean, everything really, and firmly, really agreeing with each other on the right way forward. The one issue that we had a disagreement, and it was more of emphasis than kind of a fundamental theoretical or philosophical difference, was the one Bob was mentioning about not the availability of one administration prosecuting a prior president for his acts committed in office, but as Bob said, I took a much darker view about whether that would be a good thing for the country if the current Justice Department investigated the acts in office of the prior president to see if the prior president committed crimes while in office and then to prosecute that president. That's an issue on which we had a degree of emphasis, but that was it. On everything else, we were able to reach consensus, I believe, Bob. Is that right?
That's absolutely true. And I just want to reciprocate and say, I haven't had an experience as stimulating and as rewarding that I can remember since leaving law school than I had writing this book with Jack. And I think both of us did come to it with an open mind. And we spent long days when we were able to get together and long sort of stretches on the phone and by email, just talking issues through with an openness to the arguments on the other side. And I think at the end of the day, it really, I never looked back and thought that any of the compromises or agreements that we reached on particular issues represented some sort of surrender of any basic principle or position just to reach agreement. We actually found ourselves in agreement, persuaded, each of us, that the position that we were about to adopt in the book and write up in the book was the correct position. So it was very rewarding in that respect.
I'll just say one more thing very briefly. And the one thing we did disagree on, one of our friends who read the book said, you shouldn't, we had fleshed out that disagreement in a chapter in the book. One thinks this, one thinks that. Here's an argument, here's a counter argument. Someone we admire suggested that we take that out, but we believed it was very important to keep that in the spirit with which we approach these issues. So there are 4 or 5 pages in there where Bob and I are respectfully disagreeing with one another.
We have time for one more question from the audience, and we got one from Sandra, who asks about the subpoena power. What proposals for reform do you make for the subpoenas actually being honored?
Bob, you want to take that, or do you want me to do it?
Go for it. Go ahead.
So
please.
we pick up on a proposal, and we have some proposed modifications. The basic idea is that the way the subpoena power works, let me just back up and say, the legal issues surrounding the Congress's ability to subpoena information from the executive branch, these are not settled issues. They're not clear in the law. Trump's resistance to subpoenas is not unlike prior presidents' resistances to subpoenas. This is a perennial separation of powers clash between the branches. Trump may have been more aggressive on some dimensions, but the president has a huge advantage institutionally to Congress because the president can resist the subpoena, litigate it for years, and basically run out the clock, which is more or less what Trump did. And so our proposal, and it's not unique to us, is that there be a law that fast tracks judicial considerations of these separation of powers disputes, that doesn't let years go by for it to get to the Supreme Court to resolve these issues, that tries to resolve it in a very short period of time, months, not years, so that at least the president won't have the advantage of inertia, of not turning over the information. Now, there's a danger to this, and I think we mentioned it in the book. It's not at all clear in these clashes that the Congress is going to prevail on a lot of these issues. The executive branch might prevail. And so speeding up the clock might lead to a quicker resolution that leads to outcomes that Congress doesn't like. But we still think it's important to kind of take this running of the clock power out of the presidency, try to diminish that. And that's what we propose with a few bells and whistles.
Well, that brings us to the end. There's so much to do. And Jack and Bob, not only have you done a real service describing the damage done by Trump and how to fix it, but your own teamwork in writing the book has set a very useful example in bipartisanship. It remains all too rare in our national politics these days. And it's really encouraging to hear that the two of you will be working on a follow-on project together.
Thank you so much for having us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that you can find a link in the chat column for purchasing copies of After Trump. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.